Today's lesson is Katalin Kariko and the long road to mRNA vaccines. Hello, everybody. I'm Roger.
And I'm Mike.
And today we're going to talk about vaccines, but more specifically, we're going to talk about a scientist who was helping develop a vaccine for COVID-19. And she is a scientist by the name of Katalin Kariko. Maybe you've heard of her.
Absolutely. Vaccines, of course, have been all over the news in the last year or so as the world has been dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, and Katalin Kariko is a name you might not know, but you probably should, especially if you're going to be getting several of the types of vaccines that are currently available. She's a scientist who really didn't get the recognition she probably deserved, but recently, with talk of vaccines and what we're learning more about them, where they came from, who developed them, and once you get into that question, Katalin Kariko is a name that pops up and should be much more well known than I think currently is.
Indeed. So let's dive right into this and find out who she is and the contributions that she has made. We'll listen now to the first part of our lesson.
Katalin Kariko and the long road to mRNA vaccines. Sometimes the greatest scientific discoveries are made by those whose work is ignored, but who persevere against all odds until they succeed. Katalin Kariko, whose research paved the way for today's mRNA COVID-19 vaccines, is one such person.
大家好，第一部分我们看到动词 persevere 表示坚持不懈、不屈不挠。举例来说 Even though it seemed impossible, the detective persevered and managed to solve the case. 即使这个案子看起来办不了，因为警探坚持不懈而成功破案了。另外，我们来补充一个同义动词 persist, P-E-R-S-I-S-T, persist, 指坚持或是持续。例如 Learning a language can be difficult, but you will succeed if you persist. 学会一门语言可能很难，但如果你坚持下去就会成功。再来，我们看到片语 pave the way for 加名词，指为点点点铺路，或是为点点点做好准备，使点点点容易进行。例如 Working at the newspaper paved the way for the young man to become a reporter. 在报社工作的经历让这名年轻人顺利成为记者。
Okay, so again, the title of our article for today is Katalin Kariko and the Long Road to mRNA Vaccines. So if you're talking about a long road, you're talking about something that takes a long time to happen, and lots of things have to happen, lots of things have to change until someone has success. So indeed, this idea of mRNA vaccines has been out there for quite some time, but they've had to work for a long time, and people didn't always accept it. They didn't always have enough money, so it's been a long road to develop these kinds of vaccines.
All right, so let's get into the article and find out more about Katalin Kariko and exactly how she contributed to the development of these vaccines that, of course, everyone around the world is now getting the benefits from. It says, sometimes the greatest scientific discoveries are made by those whose work is ignored, but who persevere against all odds until they succeed. Absolutely. The history of science is filled with, of course, famous scientists whose work amazed people when it was first announced or first proven. But then there are also an equal or probably a greater number of scientists who produced work during their lifetime that people said, okay. But then later on, when we learned more about science, we look back at what they were doing and kind of are amazed at how advanced, how far ahead of their time they were. So far ahead that people at that time didn't really appreciate what was going on. Sometimes, unfortunately, these scientists pass away before history recognizes them and their great work. But other times, these scientists just stick with it. They persevere against all odds until they succeed, until their work is recognized. And if you persevere, basically, you don't quit. You keep fighting through the difficulties and the challenges and the failures. You could quit. Other people might not blame you because you've had a tough go. You've given it a good chance, but maybe it's just not your lucky day or it just won't work out. But you say, no, I'm not going to quit. I'm going to keep going until eventually you succeed. So once you reach that successful destination or reach that goal, people will look back at everything you did and how hard you work and how you didn't quit. And they will say, wow, you really persevered. You really fought through the challenges and difficulties.
Of course, some of these scientists do work hard, but their work is often ignored. But they keep on working. They persevere. They believe in what they're doing, and they're doing this against all odds, which means they're doing this even though the possibility of their succeeding is very low. But they eventually succeed, or maybe they fail and nobody ever hears about them. Who knows? But one of the people we're talking about, at least the person we're talking about today, actually did persevere and did succeed, and her name is Katalin Kariko. And it says here, Katalin Kariko, whose research paved the way for today's mRNA COVID-19 vaccines, is one such person. She is an example of someone who persevered and eventually succeeded. Now, we're talking about research here. That just means work you do in order to make some discoveries and to learn something new. And remember, this is a non-count noun, so please do not add an S to this. You can't say researches. You can say studies. Studies have been done, but research has been done. Again, it's non-count.
Absolutely. And if something paves the way for something else, it basically prepares the situation for that thing. When we're talking about paving the way, it's almost like making a road, right? If you're paving a road, you're laying down a road, making it smooth and flat for all the cars that will use it in the future to go through. So if a person paves the way or some kind of situation paves the way, it basically makes whatever happens come later much easier. It sort of does the first steps or, takes the first action that later on lead to some type of success. So she was one of the original people who was looking at mRNA vaccines, and all of her work made the work that we're doing today, for example, and in many other cases with other vaccines, much easier. So who is this person, Katalin Kariko? Well, we'll find out in the second part of our article. Born in Hungary in 1955, Kariko was fascinated by science from an early age. She began her career as a researcher at the Biological Research Center of the University of Szeged, where she had obtained her PhD. But when the center lost its funding in 1985, she moved to the U.S. with her family. It was a one-way ticket, she said. We didn't know anybody.
第二部分我们看到单字 funding， 这个字是名词，指资助或是资金，像是 The project was brought to a halt after the government cut funding by half。 在政府切断资金援助后，这个计划的规模缩减了一半，或是 The professor was unable to get funding and therefore had to abandon the project。 教授没办法得到资金，所以必须放弃这个专案。
Okay, so again, we want to find out who Katalin Kariko is. Well, let's talk a little bit about her personal history. Born in Hungary in 1955, Kariko was fascinated by science from an early age. Okay, so she was born way back in 1955, and she's still going strong. And as a child, she was fascinated by science. Kids, of course, have different kinds of interests when they're young, and in this particular case, Kariko really liked science. She was fascinated by science. And so it's not surprising, it's no wonder that she eventually chose a career in the sciences.
Absolutely. So, of course, she went through the normal schooling that kids would. And then it says she began her career, her working life began as a researcher at the Biological Research Center of the University of Szeged, where she had obtained her PhD. Okay, so she basically studied at a certain school, this university in Hungary, and then continued her work working life at the same school, doing research at the Biological Research Center. This is where she had obtained her PhD, so she was a doctor by this point. But like many doctors who are investigating, vaccines, medicines, things related to the sort of world of medicine, chemicals, and things like that, she was doing work at the Biological Research Center. When we talk about biological, this is the adjective form of biology. Biology is the area of science that looks at living things, everything from plants to animals to humans. Doctors, one of their first classes, if they want to be a doctor years later, would be human biology, learning about the chemical and physical functions of the human body. So that's what she was doing at this university in Hungary.
And oftentimes you do hear the word biological to refer to your real father or your real mother. So, for example, I had a friend one time, his name was Gordon, and he was adopted as a child, and I asked him, well, did you ever meet your biological father? Did you ever meet your real father? And he said, no, he had not. So that, of course, is referring to one's real parents, if you need to use that as a reference. But here we're talking about the science of biology, and the adjective form is biological, and that's where she worked at the Biological Research Center, and she obtained her PhD there, which of course means you are a doctor of that discipline.
Absolutely. But when the center lost its funding in 1985, she moved to the United States with her family. Okay. So her career did get started in Hungary, but eventually this research center at the university there, it lost its funding in 1985. Well, that's unfortunate. So basically they ran out of money. Well, they didn't run out of money. Probably the government came in and announced that they were making changes, and they just didn't have the extra money to pay for things like biological research centers. So they basically, lost their money through some kind of change in government policy. So because her career didn't seem to be going very far, because of course to do research you need money, and it didn't seem to be going too far in Hungary, so she moved to the United States with her family. It was a one-way ticket, she said. We didn't know anybody. Wow. So like many immigrants, she was taking a big risk. She was kind of rolling the dice on doing well and succeeding and being able to make a life in a new country. They actually bought a one-way ticket to America. So we're going to make it in America, or we don't have another plan. So we have to make it in America. They were determined to persevere and carve out a new life for themselves in a new country. What a brave thing to do. And apparently it seems to have worked, but we're going to find out much more about the details of all of that in the third and final part of the article. In 1989, Kariko began working at the University of Pennsylvania. She was on track to become a full professor, but in 1995, the university demoted her because her work had failed to attract grant money. Kariko's focus was mRNA, the material in a cell that carries instructions from the DNA and directs the cell to take specific actions. Kariko believed that modified mRNA could be introduced into cells to direct them to fight diseases. At the time, the scientific community was focused on DNA, and many believed that Kariko's work lacked merit.
第三部分，我们看到动词 demote， 指使降职或是使降级。举例来说 ，David's boss demoted him after his sales numbers dropped. David 的业绩数字下滑后，老板就把他降级了。另外，我们来补充一个同义字 downgrade。D-O-W-N-G-R-A-D-E downgrade 指使降职或是使降级，也可以是贬低或是轻视。例如 Mary has been downgraded to editor. Mary 已经被降职成编辑了。或是 This company can't let management downgrade the importance of safety at work. 这间公司不能允许管理阶层轻忽工作安全问题。再来，我们看到单字 merit， 这个字是名词，指价值。例如 Alex's ideas have merit. Alex 的想法有价值。另外，这个字也有优点的意思。当它的意思为优点时，我们常用复数型来表示。举例来说 The boss talked about the many merits of your sales plan, and I think it will work well. 老板说过你的计划有很多优点， 而我觉得他会很成功。最后我们看到名词 grant， 意思是补助金或是拨款，像是 The scientists received a government grant to pay for their experiments。 这群科学家得到了一笔政府的补助金来为他们的实验买单。另外，除了上面这个意思， grant 也可以当动词，指同意、准予或是授予。我们可以说 The museum staff granted me a free pass for the day。 这座博物馆的员工给了我一张今天的通行证。另外补充一个包含 grant 的相关片语 Take something for granted， 表示将点点点视为理所当然。我们可以说 People often take their health for granted until something goes wrong。 人们通常将健康视为理所当然，直到身体出状况。
Okay, let's move on to the third and final part of our article for today. We're talking about the history of Katalin Kariko, and eventually we'll get to the time when she developed these vaccines. So let's go back to the year 1989. In 1989, Kariko began working at the University of Pennsylvania, and she was on track to become a full professor. But in 1995, the university demoted her because her work had failed to attract grant money. So she was on track to become a full professor. She was on her way. She was going to become a full professor very soon. But unfortunately, in the year 1995, she was demoted, or the university demoted her because she just wasn't bringing enough money into the university. So here we've got the word demote, which is the opposite of promote. Of course, if you're working for a company, you want to be promoted. But if they want to punish you, or if you haven't been working well, they're not going to fire you maybe. They're just going to move you to a lower position. You are going to be demoted.
And this, again, was all because of money. It seems that her life has always been a case of science versus money, with money working out. In this case, they didn't run out of funding. They just weren't getting the funding that the university wanted. A lot of American universities do make a lot of money and require a lot of money to run, and scientific research is also very expensive, and a lot of the money for scientific research at universities and hospitals comes from grants. A grant is basically a gift. It's a donation. A rich person or a company or some sort of organization will, if they're interested in helping people with cancer, they might give out grants for cancer research. We're really interested in this. We want to help support this. We want to help the scientists do this hard, expensive, long work. So we will basically give donations, give grants. We can use it both as a verb and as a noun. To grant money or to give a grant is to basically donate money. But she wasn't doing it. I guess people were like, mRNA, well, what's that? And how is that going to help anyone like today or next year? A lot of this research, it has to sort of produce results very quickly, or people lose interest and the money dries up. The money isn't coming in anymore, and that seems to be what happened. It says Kariko's focus was mRNA, the material in a cell that carries instructions from the DNA and directs the cell to take specific actions. So she was doing very original research, and it wasn't kind of in an area that maybe a lot of people really understood or really could see how it would be useful. She's working, DNA is already the building blocks of human life. She was working on what is the building block of DNA. So it was sort of, slightly unusual research for someone to be doing at that time.
Yeah, maybe it was a little radical or unusual. So it does say her focus was mRNA or messenger RNA. And again, that's the material in a cell that carries instructions from the DNA and directs the cell to take specific actions. That's quite a scientific explanation there, but yeah, it has to do with RNA and DNA and stuff like that. And Kariko believed that modified mRNA could be introduced into cells to direct them to fight diseases. So here we've got the word modified, and the verb is to modify. That means you make some changes to something so that it functions a little better or a little differently. So for example, maybe you have a robot in your home that does chores for you, but it's not really working really well, so you take it down to the shop to get it modified.
It says, at the time, the scientific community was focused on DNA, and many believed that Kariko's work lacked merit. Yes, the late 80s, early 90s saw a lot of breakthroughs in DNA research and the uses of DNA and how we can, help sick people and do many other things by manipulating and working with DNA. So many people believed that this work about mRNA, it lacked merit. Merit is basically a good quality, something positive, something useful. So they kind of looked at it and said, well, maybe for scientists it's useful, but in the real world, when making medicines and helping treat diseases, it's kind of useless. There's no point to it. It doesn't really have any value. So merit or things like value or positive or useful or something like that. And if it lacks merit, they just don't really see how it's going to do anyone good. And when people are fighting over this grant money, which is hard to come by, I guess she was just losing out.
It looks like she was about to lose out, but as we're going to find out next time, her fortunes changed, and now we have her to thank for these new vaccines. Okay, that brings us to the end of our lesson for today. It's time now to listen to our Chinese teacher.
各位同学大家好，我是 Hanny。 我们来看今天的文法重点。课文一开始写到，有时候最伟大的科学发现是由那些工作被忽略，但在困难重重下仍然坚持不懈的人所完成的。好，文中它用到 against all odds 来表达尽管困难重重的语义。那么 odds odds 在这边呢，它是指可能是达成某个目的的不利条件啊，不利环境。那么 against all odds或者是说 against the odds 就可以表达尽管困难重重还是排除万难。另外我们也可以用 overcome the odds 来表达克服万难，或者是用 beat the odds 来表达成功克服困难。举例来说， Her father beat the odds and recovered from COVID-19 她的父亲克服困难，在经历新冠肺炎后复原起来。好，我们顺便补充两个跟 odds 相关的用法。第一个我们可以用 The odds are stacked against 什么什么来表达情势不利于什么。那么 odds 在这边它是表达这个赌博的赔率，而 stack S-T-A-C-K 这个动词则是指堆放，叠成一堆。那我们常常就会用 The odds are stacked against somebody 来表达情况对某人不利而难以成功的意思。第二个补充的相关用法是 be at odds 它是表达有差异互相矛盾的意思。那么 odds 在这边它是指区别差异或者是不合啊相争的语义。 at odds 后面可以加上 with somebody 来表达跟某人对立，跟某人不合。举例来说， They have been at odds with each other 他们彼此之间一直都不合。好，那么课文第三部分用到 modify 这个单字来表达改造的语义，我们来学习它的字根。好，看到 mod 或是 mode 这一类的字根，它有度量、衡量或是方式的意思。那么在 modify 这个字当中，它的字根 mod 表示度量， ify 是动词字尾。当我们把某事物控制在度量的范围内，适度调整，不要让它超出测量范围，用这样的方式也许可以联想到 modify 它有调整、变更或是稍作修改的意思。顺便来补充两个有这一类字根的单字，第一个是 moderate M-O-D-E-R-A-T-E 好，那它的字根 M-O-D-E 表示衡量， A-T-E 是形容词字尾。那么当某事物它的数量有经过衡量，不会太多也不会太少，那就表示它是适量的、适中的。用这种方式应该可以联想到 moderate 可以用来形容是适度的、适中的或是节制的、温和的。第二个补充的是 module M-O-D-U-L-E 它的字根 M-O-D 表示样式，那么字尾 U-L-E 表示小，合在一起 module 就是用来表达模组、组件的意思。好，以上是今天重点整理，我们回顾今天的单字吧。
Research Joanne's research has contributed greatly to this field of study. Biological. The Amazon rainforest has an incredible biological diversity. Grant. Professor Jerram was awarded a grant to study elephants in the wild. Modify. This plant has been modified so that it grows faster and produces more fruit. Merit. Your ideas have a lot of merit, but you need to put them into practice. Well, that brings us to the end of another edition of our program, and please make sure you join us again next time. From all of us here, I am Mike.
I am Roger. See you next time.